All right, Chapter 8 of State and Local Government. We'll be looking at the public administration. This is also referred to as, in some cases, the bureaucracy, which reports to the governor. So this is an extension of the governor's office, you could say. And the administrative part of government has grown quite dramatically over the years. There's been an expansion of government jobs. There's more than 19 million employees in state and local government. That's what we're focusing on here. Huge payroll. And this is showing you how the state and local governments have increased as far as number of workers, whereas the federal government has somewhat leveled off over the years. So that shows you that a lot of bureaucratic functions, administrative functions, are taking on more and more at the local level. Even the federal government has delegated things down to the state and local governments over the years. From state to state, there's quite a large range depending on the size of the state and the level of activity that the bureaucrats do. And California, 21 million, Vermont, 49,000 public employees. But overall, in America, about 1 out of 6 of American workers are public employees working for state and local government. And Texas, for example, increased from 220,000 to 347,000 in that period of time as far as public employees. We have to make the distinction between public versus private organizations. Any organization is designed for purpose and efficiency. So organizations have really done quite a bit to take modern society to the next level by pooling people's resources and having an organized function, organized goal. The private organizations, these are the private firms, these are the corporations, the businesses, that sort of thing. They are driven by sales, or perhaps even more so, you could say they're driven by profits, so they have to make sales out there in the capitalist system in order to make profits. If it's a publicly owned, that's kind of an interesting term there, but if you can buy shares of stock in that private corporation, then shareholder value obviously is very important to the private organization, and they have to deal with competition with other private firms in order to sell their product or provide their service in the capitalist world for the most part. Public organizations, what we'll be focusing on here, are any type of government agencies or government departments, government bureaus. And we've got this from the federal, state, and local governments on down. The public organizations, the government organizations for the most part, are focused on meeting goals and providing service within a defined budget. So again, not driven to make a profit. They have to provide this service and have some degree of public satisfaction, or else there could be problems with trust in government. There has to be a certain amount of transparency, particularly in the bureaucratic aspects of government. A little bit different perhaps in the lawmaking side of it, which we'll talk about later. But as far as providing the services, once the laws have been passed and those need to be implemented out in society, well, the public organizations are doing that. So you've always got this constant trade-off of politics that is revolving at the top level from the governor's office and his appointees and the elected officials that are elected on a party platform. Regardless of what their party platform is, there has to be some amount of responsiveness by the bureaucracy or the public organizations in the state. And this is a table from the book. So here's some basic difference with public management. You're dealing with politics, public opinion, whereas the private firms are dealing with markets and competition. As far as the type of clients we see in accountability, we see here for the public firms, citizens are very important to getting these services out to them and accountable to the citizens, whereas private firms have to kind of appeal to the customers. They have to be able to appeal to their need to buy that product and to provide satisfaction for the product. And big difference in the purposes here. For the public managed to serve the public interest, common good, whereas the private firms are trying to make profits and continue to grow. Now, the bureaucracy, which often has negative connotations, is synonymous with the executive branch of any state, federal, or local government department. That's the part of government that is tasked with providing the services of government. Once the laws have been passed down, then the bureaucrats provide those services. And despite the overall negative connotation, surveys continue to show that most people are generally satisfied with government service. And any firms, even large private organizations, can develop bureaucratic tendencies where they get so big and have this silo mentality that two departments or two offices right across the hall from each other aren't even communicating because they have to go up the silo to their respective managers. And you can see lots of waste and bungling on any type of firm through bureaucratic tendencies. The government organizations are coined with being bureaus in order to provide services rather than to make a profit. So the connotation is obviously more towards government firms that have these bureaucratic tendencies, but all companies, all organizations can develop bureaucratic tendencies if they get big enough or perhaps confusing enough as far as who's doing what. Now, the so-called street-level bureaucrats, these are the government workers, particularly on the state and local level, that we deal with on a regular basis, such as policemen and teachers and mailmen and soldiers and things like that. So these are the people that are, regardless of what the political wind is at the top of that particular government, whether or not the Republicans are in charge or the Democrats in charge, these bureaucrats, these street-level bureaucrats, have to get the services done to the people regardless of what party seems to be in power at that time. And when you look at surveys, we see that as far as work habits and competence, and motivation, there seems to be some equal rankings there between public employees and private employees. We would obviously assume that personal achievement is perhaps more important to private employees because they are there to earn a salary and hopefully get a bonus at the end of the year and make a raise, where it's not as much of a guarantee for public employees. And so we see quite an ambition, of course, if somebody's wanting to be the owner of the company or make a lot of money, then obviously private employees would weigh that heavily. But when you look at these other factors, such as educational achievement, values of civic duty, compassion and self-sacrifice, ethics, etc., public employees rank higher on those type of things through these surveys. Public service, because of the negative connotation of bureaucrats, we see that no matter what a government worker is going to do, it's somewhat of a thankless job. Here's a case where a welfare worker was investigating a complaint from a neighbor that the children were perhaps being abused. They had bruises. The bruises did appear minor, and the mother guaranteed the caseworker that there was no danger from her apparently shiftless boyfriend who was there living with him. But a few days later, 4-year-old child is dead, boyfriend's taken off, and the caseworker is the one that's really getting hit with the brunt of the criticism there, because why didn't they take the children out of that situation? So it's really a hard call to make, and public service, somewhat of a thankless job there, but incredibly vital in a democratic society. The concept of budgeting is about who gets what, when, and how. So this is one of the main functions, of course, of a public administration, is to figure out how much funds they need, how much, because you've got, this has to be raised through tax dollars and fees and services and things like that. And well, they have to appeal to the legislature to get the funds that they need to provide the service, and they can't run a deficit at the state and local level. Somewhat considered a zero-sum game, whether I win, you lose, that sort of thing as far as who gets what in the budget, because whatever is spent has to be paid for through revenues. We can't run a deficit like we can on the federal level. Here's just a chart from the book showing the process of budgeting as far as the general actions that are taken to get to the budget. The main thing is that there's a separation of powers here. The bureaucracy or the administrative arm is the one that provides the services and needs to spend the money. However, the same people that are spending money can't be the same body that's approving the money. That's called separation of power, checks and balances. So therefore, the legislative body has to approve that budget for the bureaucratic arm, the executive branch, to spend to provide the necessary services. The fiscal year, it varies from state to state. The concept of ballot budgets means that you have to collect what you spend, and that's a requirement in 48 states, and it's just assumed as a precedent in a couple of other states. What we also have in each state is called a general fund that provides the payrolls, materials, things like that, general program goals, that sort of thing. But the budget is a constant battle. Do you need to raise taxes? Do you need to reduce expenditure? So that's kind of a trade-off. You can do one or the other. Do you have to cut services in order to be able to pay for what you need to do that may not be able to do all the services? You may need to cancel certain capital expenditures, which are new projects, not the normal day-to-day stuff. And most states have what is called a rainy day fund. And during the recession, a lot of these rainy day funds were tapped out because of declining revenues. The principal actors as far as the budget, of course, is the people that are clamoring for government services. Interest groups always want a slice of that pie as far as projects and activities that the government needs, that interest groups can have an influence on. The various agencies in the bureaucratic department that actually are tasked with spending that money. The chief executive, which is also another name for the governor, who is overseeing this public administration, overseeing the bureaucratic arm of government, and the legislative body, which is the branch of government that is responsible for making the laws. And of course, they also have to approve the budget that the agencies are wanting to spend in order to provide their services. So there's a constant battle there. Requesting too much might decline your credibility of your public administration arm. And of course, if you lowball it, or if you don't request enough, you might not be able to provide the services that you are wanting to use. And then you could actually kind of set a precedent there, is that if you ask for too low of a budget, then the legislative body may think that, well, these services aren't needed anymore, and might set a precedent in the wrong direction there. But it is a top-down enterprise as far as this budgeting and spending money. Citizens increasingly are encouraged to participate in budget hearings, but very few people do, because it's just kind of more of a mundane, boring aspect of government, where the people would rather see the results rather than deal with the money aspects. And then, of course, true to our nature, we would prefer to complain instead of look at the root causes of something as why it's not getting done, which could be addressed in the budgeting process. So what we have here in most democratic societies is a system of incrementalism, because it's hard to predict what you're going to need, particularly 5 years out in advance, or maybe even a year in advance. So what is typically done in budgeting is that small increases are given each year, assuming that what was done last year was needed and we might need a little bit more for this year. And that's certainly a lot less time consuming than a full comprehensive analysis that may be too expensive and time consuming to try to determine that out. You may want to do something like that on an occasional basis. But budgeting is much like muddling through, getting through from one year to the next, that sort of thing. There's different types of budgets. Line item is a detailed list of things that you need for that particular fiscal year. You've also got what are called performance budgets, where you're looking at a certain program where that budget may depend on meeting these outcomes, that sort of thing, as far as meeting or lowering crime rates for your police departments, lowering response times for fire departments, that's things. So that might dictate what kind of budgets are set. Capital budgets are the long-term, large-scale expenditures in investing for new projects, things like that, rather than the routine budget of normal services and payroll and stuff like that. Capital budget is for the new projects needed for major improvements. Now, the public administration in states is been revised for a long time, particularly since the 1880s when we created the civil service program. Prior to that, it was based on favoritism and patronage. People would give money to the candidates, and when they came into office, they would get these jobs. That's called patronage. So we're trying to reduce patronage through this civil service merit system, where it's based on a standard level of competence. And yes, you probably have heard it's not necessarily a myth, but it is difficult to fire civil servants because they are somewhat politically protected. The main reason for that is that when an administration changes hands from one party to the next, well, then a lot of these civil servants that were loyal to the previous party could just get summarily fired. And that's kind of what happened in the old days. So what we wanted to do is establish a consistent professional bureaucracy, a staff that would serve to maintain throughout from one administration to the next and have expertise their main function or their main criteria rather than their loyalty to whoever appointed them. So been lots of reform over the years as far as recruiting in certain progressive manners, new concepts for testing, perhaps even making the bureaucrat system a little bit more like the private system to pay them for their performance and incentives to get the bureaucrats to improve their services, that sort of thing. But as we saw a minute ago, as far as the public satisfaction of civil servants, it's hard to measure any difference because of the goals, whether your goal is to maximize your profit or your goal is to provide a service. It's very difficult to tell a dramatic difference in competence in that sort of thing. So the controversies with our merit system here is that is our bureaucracy representative of the population? And you could perhaps argue because of hiring practices in governments that it probably is a little bit more representative than our elected officials. We see that our elected officials, in most cases, we have considerably fewer minorities and women in our representative bodies than we do in the population at large. But as far as hiring practices, yes, probably a little bit more representative. Affirmative action is really trying to make sure that people are getting a fair shake at work. We'll look at some examples here. There's also the ongoing evolution of reducing sexual harassment at work. In probably a little bit easier to address on the public sector than perhaps the private sector, where you've got a little bit more private motivations going on there. And the we have a lot of labor unions, collective bargaining at the state and local level in certain types of jobs, whereas in the private sector, labor unions have really diminished quite dramatically over the last 30 years or so. So, according to theory, you could say that bureaucracy should reflect the components of society, and you could certainly argue that it may be a little bit more representative than a private sector at large when people are hiring people like them, whereas in the government there's a little bit more of incentives to hire a more diverse workforce. The street level bureaucrats that we talked about earlier, they certainly have some amount of discretion. Police have to decide when to pull you over. Soldiers have to decide when to act or to do certain things. Teachers have a lot of discretion as far as conducting their classrooms. So these are what we call the street level bureaucrats that are very important function in our society, and they have quite a bit of autonomy to do what they think needs to be done based on their training and responsibility. So the idea is to have a bureaucratic workforce that is representative of the people it governs. If you have, and we've seen this in some police forces, where you have a predominantly, almost extraordinarily white police force that has jurisdiction over a predominantly minority neighborhood, and that has resulted in some frictions as we've seen in the last few years. So that might be one thing to address there, is have a representative bureaucratic workforce that's similar makeup to the people that it serves. So government of the people, by the people. Affirmative action is where we are making efforts to hire groups that have been a victim of past discrimination. And there's a lot of interesting court cases that are showing kind of a back and forth type of progression on this, as to whether or not our society feels like that we need this or whether we don't need this. And case there in '96 where they talked about the use of race as a selection criteria is really not any more rational than using somebody's blood type. So that particular case says we cannot use race as a criteria for hiring. And the proposition in California there around that same time prohibited race and gender considerations in contracts and hiring, and that was upheld by the Supreme Court. So at that particular time, there was a pushback against requiring people to hire as far as more diverse candidates, that sort of thing, but it has gone back and forth. In this case, with the University of Michigan, the court reverses that Hopwood ruling and upholds that race as a non-quantified plus in admissions decisions there. Another recent case, Fisher versus University of Texas at Austin. Of course, that case was actually sent back to the lower courts, and we see that we still have a little bit of back and forth going here, but in 2014, the court upholds the Michigan ban on affirmative action in admission to public universities. However, in 2016, as an extension of this Fisher UT, the court allows the race-conscious admission. So we still see that it's kind of going back and forth. We don't live in a perfect world. Racism still exists. Discrimination still exists. How much or how little do we need to force firms to not discriminate or to promote diversity, that sort of thing? That will be a continued debate for quite a long time. I guess probably as long as we're humans. Sexual harassment is something that perhaps was a little bit earlier addressed on the government level. There's been some major cases there as far as that goes, whereas private firms have been a little bit further along in complying, that sort of thing, harder to perhaps bring cases to private firms, but half of women over time have reported being some victim of sexual harassment, lower percent of men. But since 1979, when we started to see a little bit more, particularly on the public sector, that nearly every state has adopted a policy on sexual harassment, and even as an employee of the college, I have to go through these training programs that make sure that I'm aware of what the school requires or does not allow, that sort of thing. And since the 60s, when women started to gradually enter into the workforce, we see that about one half of the workforce, just as that half the population is women, now we see about half the workforce is women. Now, public sector unions have risen, whereas private sector unions have declined. The public sector is generally less paid. There's less benefits per se on the public sector, particularly with respect to raises and bonuses and things like that. So therefore, the public sector unions, such as teachers unions and that sort of thing, have been more active in increasing the labor union representation, whereas out in the private sector, particularly since the 80s, private sector unions have declined quite dramatically. But in the public sector, because of this bureaucratic, somewhat impersonal nature of work, there may be more incentives to try to get some assistance through unionizing, and perhaps a little bit less confidence in civil service systems as far as getting promotions, that sort of thing. And there are 43 states that have agreed to the right to collective bargain, which that means groups can bargain with their employer, in this case the state, in order to prove their salaries and prove their conditions. So we see quite a dramatic difference here. About 35% of state workers and about 47% of local government workers belong to unions, whereas out there in the private sectors, it's down around 6 or 7%, somewhere around that. So quite a big dramatic decrease in the private sector unions, whereas the public sector unions have shown a slight increase over the years. Now, the public officials then find themselves under greater pressure now to settle labor disputes, and there could be some arguments out there is that public services may not be legally required to strike because they are vital services that are needed. They're not relying on customers' preferences. So there is a little bit of pushback on that, where the ability to strike does give them some political clout. However, there have been some cases where they were illegal in striking because they were responsible for providing very very important public sector type services, and for that reason we say they are generally less successful at trying to negotiate for wage increases because of the necessity of them to keep providing these public services, whereas private firms may have a little bit more flexibility or leeway as far as workers for private firms. Here's a map showing the states. There's still a few states that have no collective bargaining, and then some states that allow some part of it. But we see quite a few states that do allow for comprehensive collective bargaining for their public employees. Now, the bureaucracy itself is charged with implementing the laws that have been passed on to it by the legislature, the lawmaking branch, that makes the laws and then hands them over to the bureaucracy to implement the laws. So that gives the bureaucratic arm, the public administration, what we call some bureaucratic discretion, because those laws cannot possibly describe every detail. So the bureaucrats in the government that are providing these services or implementing these laws have some room to interpret or translate or even fill in between the lines there, fill in the blanks, that where the law may not be completely clear. And this is where the administrative arm of government goes through what we call the rulemaking process, which we won't go into any significant detail here, but the bureaucratic arm has to go through this rulemaking and regulation making progress in order to implement those laws out into the state. And so there's lots of interest groups, also referred to as clientele groups, that are influencing or putting pressure on government to get laws passed in their favor. And of course, that pressure also continues throughout the rulemaking process, where that pressure can also go on the bureaucracy in these hearing processes in order to these clientele groups, these interest groups, pressure groups, lots of different names for them, in order to get those laws implemented in such a way that it benefits their group. And so elected officials must be held accountable, while at the same time we're trying to minimize the amount of oversight over our elected officials. So that's part of this checks and balances, that the bureaucracy does have a little bit of oversight type function here, and vice versa, as far as trying to make sure that the other branch is doing its share of the load, that sort of thing. Might get into that a little bit more detail later. Now, this concept of new public management, and this varies from state to state, where you're trying to improve your efficiency as far as getting your services done. So they may be allowing for some form of entrepreneurship amongst the bureaucrats, for them to perhaps being a little bit more creative in implementing these services. We're starting to see some experimentation as far as public-private partnerships, such as in water systems and things like that, where it may be publicly owned but privately run, that sort of thing. A little bit more intergovernmental cooperation between state and local governments, where state governments may be delegating a little bit more down to local governments, or else perhaps even consolidating services across several jurisdictions in the state to perhaps reduce expense and improve service, that sort of thing. And this concept of new public management, which has been around for a couple of decades, in order to try to improve the efficiency of the bureaucracy and the services that the bureaucracy provides. And so privatization is a really tough thing to make work, because if a government's been providing that service for all this time, if it had been able to be privatized, in other words, a private firm do it for a profit, it probably would have been done a long time ago. So a lot of experimentation with privatization of services is kind of iffy, but what is more prevalent is contracting or outsourcing these services, whereas the government still is paying for that, but they might be getting a little bit better delivery by contracting it out to a private firm, such as privatizing jails, whereas somebody would get a contract to run a jail. The money would still be provided by the state budgets, but that jail might be run a little bit more efficiently or a little bit cheaply. And it's hard to prove across the board, because in many cases, when you look at a lot of these services that have been experimented with, either full-out privatization or in most cases just contracting it out, you got real mixed results as far as getting any better service or whether or not you're saving money. There are some cases where you are seeing some substantial savings by contracting out, because you're reducing a lot of the government management cost. The contractor is taking on a lot of those costs, and he's bid on that at a price that would be less perhaps than what the government could do it. So we do see some savings there, but there's a trade-off. You may be saving money, but are you getting as good a service as you did? Is there enough oversight? Could there be some abuse of that privatization or that contracting of that particular service to a private firm? And is oversight needed, which would really kind of add to the costs in there. Now, e-government is doing more services online, virtual offices. That way we can get perhaps quicker service, instant feedback, things like that. Again, the book talks about the issues as to how effective that is, kind of like with the trade-offs of teaching this class online as opposed to teaching the class in a classroom. There's definitely some advantages one way or the other, and there's disadvantages either way. So that's what we have to weigh out. So providing a lot of your government services online is part of that trade-off as well. And here are a couple of websites there as far as looking at the public administration bureaucratic functions of government.